Alright guys, BLM here, and this is going to be my guide to International Survivor. And now, I'm a massive Survivor fan. I've watched every US season multiple times. I've watched every international season. I've watched most of them multiple times. So, through this video, we're going to go through every English language international season of Survivor, obviously every season outside of the US. So, that will be 6 seasons of Survivor South Africa, 5 seasons of Australian Survivor, 2 seasons of Survivor UK, 2 seasons of Survivor New Zealand, and 1 pan-regional season. So that is a total of 16 seasons. So for how we're going to get through these seasons, we're going to go in mostly chronological order. There are a couple seasons that will be grouped together, but for the most part, we'll do it chronologically. So let's get started. Alright, so the first season that we're going to be talking about here is Survivor UK. Survivor UK Season 1, also known as Survivor UK Pulau Tiga. This came out 1 year after Survivor Borneo did in the United States, and you could tell they're trying to replicate a lot of things about Survivor Borneo. And to be honest, it fails in almost every single way. And the problem with this season is, one, the cast is so much weaker than Survivor Borneo. Most of the people are pretty dry, pretty boring. Most of them being pretty unlikable, especially the people that do make it towards the end. However, something that is better here than in Borneo is the gameplay. There are some strategic people here. For example, this is actually the first time where someone actively tries to take someone to the end as a GOAT. There's also someone who tries to manipulate the tiebreaker rules, which at the time were most votes at previous tribal councils. So a person comes up with a plan to put votes on a whole bunch of different people, which this ends up playing a massive factor in the end game. Despite the spike in gameplay from Borneo, this season is still way too dry as a whole. Another problem this season is that the way it's edited. The way it's edited and the way it's presented is as a documentary. The host is actually there to introduce a lot of these scenes where he's walking on the beach and talks about what's about to happen. Overall, though, this is not a season I would recommend unless you're an enormous Survivor fan, unless you're an enormous fan of older Survivor, as in, like, I would say Survivor Borneo to Marquesas, but don't expect it to be nearly as fun. Again, not as many fun characters, not as many fun moments, though there is some interesting gameplay, and to be honest, a pretty interesting winner. And now to follow up that, we got Survivor UK Panama, which is season 2 of Survivor UK, and also the final season. And this is the worst season of Survivor I have ever watched, and it's not even close. So what happened is that the last season of Survivor was a pretty big failure in terms of ratings. At least it underperformed based on what the channel wanted. So they decided, you know what, let's make a lot of changes. So instead of a 16-person cast, let's make it a 12-person cast. And you know what? Let's add in a public vote for the winner, which, I mean, mind you, it's only 1 vote. Thankfully, it's not the deciding thing, but it's still not great. And also, guess what? Have an even more boring cast than the previous season. I think I do need to go through spoilers on this one just to really emphasize my point here. Essentially, this season starts off with 12 people, split into 2 tribes of 6. What happens, each tribe loses 2 of those tribal councils. On both of those tribes, 1 person quits. The other 2 people who go home are the 2 more interesting people in the game. Then we get to the merge at 8, tribes 4 to 4. Guess what happens? The tribes come together and say, you know what, let's make an agreement. You're going to vote for this person, and we're going to vote for that person. And that's what they do. And the entire game at that point is determined by the tiebreaker, which the tiebreaker rules at that point were first tied votes, which again, both of them had the same amount. So then it went to a quiz. So the entire game is dictated by a quiz. And guess what happens after that? A pagonging, obviously. And then we're down to 4. And guess what? There's a solid 3-person alliance within that 4 that was made on day 1. So guess what? The 4th person goes home with 1 person who is looked at as the GOAT of the season. The GOAT wins immunity, takes the person who had an alliance with from the very beginning of the game, and loses unanimously. That's the season. This season sucks. I really wouldn't recommend it unless you really went on a venture like I did to watch every international season. Outside of that, do not watch this season. Alright, now the next series that we're going to be talking about is Australian Survivor. And Australian Survivor here started in 2002 after the success of the Australian Outback. And what they did is that they aired this in Australia instead of Survivor Marquesas. I think hands down, this is one of the worst casts in the history of Survivor, where they're just all so boring. Like, everyone on this season is so dry and monotone in their confessionals, and there's no humor throughout the entire season, and this is all not helped by its very mundane location. And then the gameplay for the entire season is pretty standard, and then we get to the merge. It's your typical pagonging, though there is one big move that does happen this season, which shapes the entire season. And because of that, I think we get one of the best winners in the history of Survivor. I'm really, really impressed with what the winner of this season was able to do. However, again, this season is edited kind of similarly to Survivor UK. So very slow paced. So yeah, this season sucks. Again, another one I won't recommend watching, especially because there's much better Australian Survivor seasons to come. And especially because no one really talks about the season. The season isn't really considered part of the Australian Survivor canon currently. It's not really a season I would recommend watching. And let's continue on with Australian Survivor, where we got Australian Celebrity Survivor, also known as Celebrity Survivor Vanuatu, which was made in 2006. Now, the previous company that aired Australian Survivor 2002, they still owned the rights to Survivor at that point. However, Seven Network found a loophole to buy the rights to Celebrity Survivor. So they decided to make their own series. And it's a mixed bag for me. I think it reminds me a lot of Celebrity Big Brother in the way that it's presented, where it's smaller cast. Again, only 12 people. But I do think there's some fun personalities on this season. And there are some pretty big moves that are made throughout the season. Now, the problem with this season are the twists. Especially because we have a pretty fun pre-merge. Once we get to the merge, it does slow down a good chunk. The twist that does happen at the end of the game. We're at the final three. And guess what? There's Redemption Island or Extinction Island or whatever, where the people from Ponderosa come back to compete in the challenge. The top 2 people in that challenge return to the game. But this is terrible, and it really ruins the end game here. Another twist that's really dumb that's in this season is the tiebreaker rules. For some reason, the jury gets to vote someone out. It's a really strange season. I mean, if you don't care about strategy, I would still recommend this season because I do think it's fun, but overall, not a great season. So we're going to talk more about Australian Survivor a bit later, but now let's move on to Survivor Africa Panama, which was a pan-regional season. That is the only season I have not watched. And the reason for that is because there's no copy of it online. And still, like online, the only thing I can find are a couple bio videos and pictures of the cast. And then the results are online if you look on Wikipedia. So really, this is a hard season to find footage for, but I decided to mention it anyway because it is still an English language season. And now let's talk about the longest running series in international Survivor history in terms of English language seasons, and that is Survivor South Africa. And we're going to start off season 1 here, Survivor South Africa Panama, which was filmed at the same time as Survivor Africa Panama in the same location. They were actually airing at the same time. And I gotta say, I like this season. I really do. Now, downsides right away. Terrible production value. The picture quality is really bad. Audio is pretty bad. A pretty mediocre host. You got a decent cast, though. I think the cast, it's a bit mixed. There's some people who really are non-factors, but there's some really big characters. One in particular. This season really reminds me a lot of Australian Celebrity Survivor in the sense of how the game plays out. This is another season with a bit of a smaller cast, around 14 people. They merge at 7. Again, it just plays out pretty similar, where the pre-merge, there's a lot of flips back and forth. But again, like Australian Celebrity Survivor, the post-merge gets a bit dull. Another thing from the post-merge that I did not like is, guess what? There's another twist. Dead Man's Island, which essentially is the same thing as what happened in Australian Celebrity Survivor, where at the final 3, they decide to do a challenge with the 4 people who were voted out post-merge at that point. And 2 of the people come back into the game. In Celebrity Survivor, they were on Ponderosa. Here, at least they're on an island, so it's slightly better. However, a big problem with the end game of this season, which I did not particularly like, which they also do in Survivor Africa Panama, and they'll also do in the next season that we talk about, is that the final 4 boot is determined by a challenge. At the final 4, the remaining 4 people compete in a challenge. The winner wins immunity, obviously. The loser gets eliminated. With this season, what also happens in Survivor Africa Panama is that the 2 people that placed in the middle, 2nd and 3rd place, they compete in another challenge. The winner of that challenge is the 2nd member of the final 2. The loser is eliminated. It really screws over some people in the game. And also, just the twist that people come back in general screws over probably the most dominant player of the season. But there we go. That's pretty much the entire season. Survivor South Africa Panama, if you can find it, which some of the episodes are on YouTube, I would recommend this season. I do actually really enjoy it. It is a bit slower paced than your modern season. I would still recommend the season as a whole. I do think it's a lot of fun. And now moving on to season 2 of Survivor South Africa, which came out next year in 2007. 7. And this is pretty much a downgrade from season 1 in every single way. I mean, production value is still the same. It's still pretty bad. The cast is a lot more unlikable. The gameplay of the season is pretty standard. Post-merge, pagonging, that sort of stuff. There's a few flips here and there, but for the most part, not super interesting. They do still have the Final Four challenge in this season. They make it slightly better here, where the person at the Final Four, the loser, does still get eliminated. However, the person who wins the challenge at the Final Four acts as a winner of the Final 3 immunity, where they vote out one of the 2 people who did not win the challenge. But really, there's not really much to talk about this season. It's really just a forgettable season, and a season that I wouldn't necessarily recommend. However, if you have already watched season 1 of South Africa, I feel like you might as well watch season 2 just to get the full history of the series. But at the end of the day, this is not a great season. And now let's move on to season 3 of Survivor South Africa, which was kind of a reboot. 3 years have passed since season 2, and they brought in a new host, and they brought a new format here, with this essentially being a celebrity version of Survivor. 18 celebrities were on this cast, and to be honest, I really enjoy this cast. But the season doesn't get off to a great start. The premiere episode is very confusing with the way they start the game, where they're split into 2 different groups who don't end up being the actual tribes, and they have a whole bunch of really weird twists. The game just starts off super strange, and none of this has really any impact. Now, in terms of twists outside of that, this is actually the first international season that has a hidden immunity idol. Mind you, it is Guatemala rules for some reason. The tiebreaker in this season is still previous votes, but there's some pretty great strategy in the post-merge that revolves around this. It's a really interesting way to play the game, where there's a lot of manipulation of the vote count. And because of that, there's a pretty crazy post-merge with a lot of really strange votes happening, though this season does have a pretty controversial ending. This is one of the few seasons that I think is entertaining throughout, and this is definitely the best season that we've talked about so far. And now we move on another year. The next year, season 4 of Survivor South Africa aired, which is Survivor South Africa Maldives. And the format of the season is pretty similar to the last. However, instead of all celebrities, it's actually only half celebrities. It's celebs versus plebs, plebs being just normal people. And something that's interesting about this season, that normally you would see the celebs on one tribe, the normal people on the other tribe. With this season, they actually mix the 2 groups by episode 2, so it actually brings a pretty interesting dynamic to the season. The cast, though, is pretty mixed. There's some really great characters, but there's also some real big clunkers. And to be honest, most of the misses on this cast are the celebs. A lot of the celebs you could tell that they don't really care. Now, in terms of twists, this is actually the first international season with the modern hidden immunity idol. And then there's 2 other twists that are introduced through the season, one in the pre-merge, one in the post-merge. The first one doesn't really play that much of an impact. It's called the Black Cowrie, and it's this shell that one person wears around their neck. This person has an automatic vote cast against them at every single tribal council they go to. This doesn't really play much of a factor. One vote really in the pre-merge here doesn't really change much. However, the other one that does have a pretty major impact is the White Cowrie, where this twist has the opposite effect, where the person wears it around their neck, and at tribal council, they can pass this shell off to someone else. The person who receives the shell has 1 vote against them nullified. This plays a pretty major factor in the endgame, and leads to a pretty ridiculous vote at the final 6. Overall, though, I think the gameplay in this season is pretty great. There are some moments of like, oh, honor and integrity sort of thing, but there's a lot of flips throughout the entire season. And I think this is a more consistent season than the previous one. And while the cast is a bit top heavy, this is a season I would definitely recommend to people if you can find it, because to be honest, this is one of the hardest seasons to find online right now. And now we're getting pretty modern. Here we're at 2014, season 5 of Survivor South Africa Champions. And yeah, they took a 3-year break. They finally came back. And I think this is a great season. Now, it has major issues, though. As the season is called, it's called Champions. Now, you would think that would be like an all-star season or something, but no. Instead, the 2 tribes in this season are captained by sports champions. They are not considered players in the game. However, they do cast a vote at the final tribal council. In the pre-merge, they're really only there to captain the tribes, help them in challenges. In the post-merge, they compete in a challenge where the winner gets to nullify 1 vote at tribal council. This is an extended season. Most of the seasons we've talked about so far have been actually pretty short, like 12 to 13 episodes. This is actually an 18-episode season. And because of that, there's a lot of uneven editing. There's a much slower pace. 2 of those episodes are non-elimination episodes. Where this season really shines, though, is the gameplay. This is the first season that has some real super fans of the game involved. And some really interesting gameplay happens throughout the entire season. Mind you, this can only be said for about half the cast. I think half the cast is pretty forgettable, pretty unmemorable, but the other half is pretty good. Great characters, great players. Now for the final downside of the season, though, is the fact that the idol rules. There are no real idol rules here, so there's a lot of weird shenanigans going on with stealing idols, and it's really just kind of a dumb thing where people have to always worry of, oh, are they going to steal my idol? Oh my god, I better hide it. But it does lead to some great moments, but it also is pretty unfair for the actual players. Overall though, this is a great season. The gameplay is that of a modern season of Survivor. There's some really great votes towards the end of the game. The entire end game is insane. And really, this is one of my favorite international seasons. Despite its massive flaws, I would still recommend this season. Alright, now we're finally getting to the seasons that most people know. We're here at 2016 with the revival of Australian Survivor. There's a lot of major changes here. It's a completely different format than your regular US Survivor. Instead of 39 days or 27 to 29 like Survivor South Africa, Australian Survivor here lasts 55 days with 24 people, an extended episode count of 26 episodes. And to me, this is the worst part of Australian Survivor. This is what really harpens these seasons, is the fact that it's so long, and because of all these episodes, and a lot of these episodes are over an hour long, it really ruins the pacing of the season. There's a lot of repeated content, and to be honest, the season just really drags out. However, in terms of the cast, even though there are 24 people, I think this is a pretty strong cast. There are a couple duds, as you would normally have with any season of Survivor. There are a few people that are preaching honor and loyalty, and sadly a lot of those people do make it pretty far into the game, which kind of stifles the gameplay. Speaking of gameplay, the gameplay in the pre-merge is really good. There's a lot of flips, a lot of blind sides. However, once we get to the merge, like a lot of these international seasons, it really slows down. And at the end of the game, it does get picked up a little bit, but really for the most part, the post-merge is very, very underwhelming. And then also the bad thing of 26 episodes, which, mind you, there's 24 people, which guess what? That means non-elimination episodes, and a lot of them too. They decided to add in a whole bunch of twists to explain why people don't go home in this episode. And because of that, a lot of people's games get screwed over by this, including probably one of the best players of the season. I say this is a decent starting point if you want to get introduced into International Survivor, especially because this is a pretty easy season to find as well. If you're looking to get into International Survivor, this is a decent place to start. And 1 year later, Australian Survivor got renewed, and we got Australian Survivor 2017. Pretty much follows the same format as Australian Survivor 2016. Instead of 3 tribes of 8, there are 2 tribes of 12, which I actually really like. I think it brings an interesting dynamic to the game. However, obviously because of the massive amount of people on each tribe, there are a lot of people that get overshadowed by the edit here. That being said, there's some really great characters on this season. This is a really great cast overall, with almost every person in this game playing super hard trying to win the game, which you can't always say for these international seasons. The season starts off really great. The first 2 episodes are fantastic, with the second episode being probably one of my favorite episodes of Australian Survivor ever. And to be honest, it keeps up for a lot of the pre-merge. Once the swaps happen, the gameplay really starts to slow down. And that's also where we start to lose some of the more invisible people in the season. But then by the time we get to the merge, it's back on. With the first 4 episodes after the merge being incredible, with the final 9 vote being probably the most insane vote in the history of Survivor. However, after the final 9 vote, I do feel like it slows down again. And it slows down for a decent while. There's a couple high points in the end game, with the final 6 and final 4 votes being super interesting. But outside of that, it kind of ends on a whimper. Now, Australian Survivor 2017 is probably one of the most popular international seasons of Survivor. A lot of people call this one of the best seasons of all time. Overall, though, this is definitely a season to watch. This is definitely a season of International Survivor to get into. Again, I did say watch the first season. However, if you start to watch the first season and you don't get into it, I do recommend watching 2017 here, because it is definitely one that you need to watch at some point. And now let's move on to the most recent season at the time of this recording, which is Australian Survivor Season 3, also known as Australian Survivor Champions vs. Contenders. I really like this season. I know this season gets a lot of mixed opinions. A lot of people don't like this season. But for me, I thought this was a really fun season. And some of the reason for that is that they made some changes for the better. One, they reduced the amount of days to 50, and they also reduced the episode count by 2. However, there's still a lot of pacing issues. There's still a lot of repeated confessionals, but for the most part, it is better. But what makes me really like this season, though, is its cast. I think overall, this might be my favorite cast of Australian Survivor, with very few duds. And I think the duds that are there, they go out very early in the pre-merge. Now, the actual twist of Champions versus Contenders is essentially kind of celebs versus normal people, with a lot of them being sports players. And the producers really dug deep into that, which made a lot of the challenges more physical. But for me, though, the Champions, though, were a massive surprise from a character standpoint, from a gameplay perspective. Because everyone came into this season thinking, you know what, they're probably not even going to play the game. They're probably not even going to care. But so many of these champions were playing really hard. Speaking of playing hard, if you're a fan of US Survivor, obviously another element to this season is that Russell Hantz is involved in this season. But again, the major downside of this season is the editing. The editing is so uneven. The biggest character of the entire season, the person who gets the most confessionals of the entire season, doesn't even have a single confessional within the first 6 episodes of the series. And there's a whole bunch of other big characters that you see how big of a character they are through the camp scenes, but they just don't give them any confessionals. But in terms of the actual game, again, the pre-merge is a bit mixed. I feel like the first 2 episodes are really, really strong. The next 4 episodes or so are a bit slower. But then after that, I feel like the rest of the pre-merge plays out pretty strong. The post-merge is just incredible, with the final 9 and final 8 votes being 2 of the most fun boots in the history of Australian Survivor. Overall, though, this is still a mixed season for me. While I do like it a lot more than other people, I do understand why people don't like it. I wouldn't really recommend this as the first season for you to watch if you're trying to get into International Survivor. I do think you should start with at least 2017, maybe even 2016. But Champions vs. Contenders is still a good season in my book. All right, now it's time for the next series that started in 2017, and that is Survivor New Zealand. So we're going to start off with season 1, which is Survivor New Zealand, Nicaragua. A couple things to mention about this season. 1, there are no hidden immunity idols. And 2, and sadly, there is Redemption Island. The way this season is structured is that there are 20 episodes, however, there's only a 16-person cast. This leads to what I think is the biggest problem this season, is that there's only a vote out once every other episode. Thankfully, they were smart enough to start the premiere with 2 people going to Redemption Island. But after that, it's 1 episode where someone gets voted out, next episode is Redemption Island. And with a lot of these episodes being around an hour long, that leads to a lot of pacing issues. And that's the biggest problem with this season, is the pace. It's super slow. It's really a pain to watch, which is a shame because I do think there's some really fun gameplay happening here. I think in the pre-merge, there's some really fun votes. And then the beginning of the post-merge is super fun as well, until Redemption Island kicks in. And again, this is another series where for some reason they decided to have Redemption Island come into effect at the final 3, where 2 people came back from Redemption Island. The cast overall is average. I don't think there's anyone that's really bad TV. But there's not many characters that really stick out. And the problem with the cast is that it doesn't really feel like a lot of these people are playing that hard. I mean, the entire endgame pretty much turns into a popularity contest where individual people are trying to help other people win. Overall, though, this is a pretty bad season. It's a massive slog, and it's not a season I would recommend. I really wish that there was a cut of this season to cut it down to like 13, 14 episodes, because at that point, this actually turns into probably an average season. But because of that, it turns out to be one of the worst seasons I've ever watched. All right, now we're moving on to the next year, 2018, with the second season of Survivor New Zealand, Thailand. And what a massive improvement this is. For New Zealand season 1 to season 2, so many improvements happen here. First off, 18-person cast, no Redemption Island, no non-eliminations, the modern hidden immunity idol is implemented. Pretty much all my complaints about the first season are rectified here, and a lot of the honor and integrity that went into the first season is really stripped out of this season. However, like the first season, I do think the cast is still a bit average. There are a couple standout characters, but again, kind of just similar to the first season. But again, where the cast really shines here is the gameplay. All of them are playing super hard. Even the people that are hung up on honor and integrity, even they're playing hard, they're making alliances, they're trying to get further in the game. No one's throwing away their game for other people. Well, maybe there's one, but we won't talk about that. Though the season is shorter here, they did cut it down to around the same length as the US Survivor season. All the episodes are still around an hour, even after taking out all the commercials. So there's still a lot of pacing issues. 2 people on this season did know each other and were actually good friends before the season that production did not know about. And this plays such a massive impact on the season as a whole. I do think the pre-merge takes a little bit to pick up. The initial few episodes, while they aren't strong in terms of gameplay, they are really strong in terms of character moments. And I feel like from episode 4 on, the entire rest of the pre-merge is pretty good. And then the entire post-merge is pretty solid as well. I do think maybe there's like 1 or 2 episodes that maybe drag a little bit, but a lot of interesting gameplay happens in the post-merge, in particular the final 9 and the final 6 votes, with the final 6 vote being one of the best moves in the history of International Survivor, possibly even one of the best moves in the history of Survivor in general. Overall, though, I do think this is a pretty good season. If you were let down by season 1, I do think you should give season 2 a shot. It improves upon it in every single possible way. And while we're not going to be getting a season 3 for a time being due to the show being put on hiatus due to low ratings, I do think this is a great season, one I do recommend watching. Alright, let's bring it home. The final season of International Survivor to talk about here is season 6 of Survivor South Africa, Philippines. Now, this was a reboot of Survivor South Africa that happened in 2018 after 4 years off since Champions. I do feel like this is probably my favorite season of International Survivor. Now, this was a full-on reboot. While it does still have the same hosts, it's a completely different production crew. And let me just say this here. This is the most ridiculous season of Survivor ever. Like, it's Survivor Gabon on crack. Like, it's literally the most insane season. There's so many strange, weird characters throughout the entire season. Some weird gameplay decisions throughout the entire season. It's just the perfect mix of strategic moments and character moments. And that starts off right away. Like, just watch the first episode. If you can find the first episode, watch it. It's the most ridiculous episode you'll ever see. And then by the time you finish watching episode 2, it really solidifies it even more. Those first 2 episodes are just so ridiculous. You do get a couple slower episodes here and there, but even when the season slows down, there's still character moments to pick it up. And that's why I think even though this isn't the most consistent season in terms of entertainment, where there are probably a couple boots that are pretty boring, just the sheer craziness of the season makes it one of the best seasons I've ever watched. And because of that, I do recommend you watch this season. Again, it's a little bit tougher to find than the Australian seasons or the New Zealand seasons. But if you can find this season, definitely give it a shot. So to sum it up, the best places to start if you want to get into more modern seasons, I do think Australian Survivor 2016 is probably a good place to start. I think New Zealand Season 2 is a good season as well. And then Survivor South Africa Philippines. I would also say that some of the older South Africa seasons are worth watching as well, in particular seasons 3, 4, and 5. And after you start watching some international seasons, I do think you should also give Australian Survivor 2017 a try, even Champions versus Contenders. So there we go. That's every English language international season of Survivor. Hope you enjoyed watching the video. Thank you for watching.